Welcome back, everybody, to our conversation about supply and demand. Today, we're going to look more specifically at the supply curve and begin to, again, differentiate between a change in supply or a shift in supply versus a movement along the supply curve. We'll look at the determinants of supply, and we'll begin to look at equilibrium in a little bit more detail, trying to identify what is a surplus, what is a shortage, how do we see that on the graph, and why is it that the market will find its equilibrium at the intersection of supply and demand. So why is the market price and quantity found at that intersection point, that equilibrium? So let's look at supply first. Just like with demand, the supply schedule determines the supply curve. The supply schedule is just that combination of price and quantity, all the possible combinations of price and quantity that would exist given a certain set of assumptions. And that supply schedule is graphed out with the vertical axis being price, the horizontal axis being quantity, and it is an upward sloping curve. And it is upward sloping because of what we call the law of supply, that as the price rises, the quantity supplied will increase. And that's going to be consistent across pretty much all products and services. When we get to discussing the labor market, we'll see that there are times in which the supply curve sort of bends backward, but it's not really relevant to our conversation, though it technically, supply curves don't always go up. But for our purposes, they will always draw them as upward sloping curves. And just like with demand, there is a distinction between a change in price, which leads to a change in quantity demanded, and a change in the determinants of supply, which leads to a shift in the supply curve. So a change in price occurs, but because we're saying ceteris paribus, there's only one thing changing. The only thing changing is price. My underlying assumptions remain the same, so the curve itself remains the same. My combination of prices and quantities are the same. I'm just moving to a different point along that existing curve. So when there's a change in price, change in quantity supplied. Any other changes would in fact lead to a shift in the supply curve. Visually, what we're saying is an increase in the price would lead me to being willing to produce more goods. So we go up from the equilibrium point and then to the right, we find a new equilibrium point. That equilibrium point is lying on the existing supply curve. So I can see very clearly that an increase in price leads to a change in quantity supplied. The supply curve remains the same. All right, there is a movement along the supply curve with an increase in price, all else being equal. Shifts occur when there's a change in my willingness to sell, when my underlying assumptions are changing, when at a set price, I want to produce more of a good or less of a good. So shifts occur with a change in the determinants of supply. Graphically, what we're saying is that if I'm increasing the amount of a good I'm willing to sell, that generally leads to a lower price because there's more available. And that lower price finds an equilibrium point along an existing demand curve. The original supply curve can't get to that point. We have to have a new supply curve that in this case has shifted to the right. There's no longer equilibrium at the original spot. There is a new equilibrium point, and it's only found by shifting the supply curve. So a change in the determinants of supply leads to a shift. Changes in the determinants of supply result in a change in price. What are those determinants of demand? We have another mnemonic. This mnemonic is TRICE. We're looking at technology, related prices, input prices, competition, and our expectations. With technology, what we're saying is basically the better the technology in the production of goods and services, the lower the cost of production. And when things are cheaper to make, there is an incentive for producers to make more of that good. They can make more for the same cost. So they can make more at the same price, and that causes the supply curve to shift. to the right. So sort of the more productive you get as a result of technology, the more goods you're going to make. We also have related goods. Just like with demand, we have substitutes and we have complements. Substitutes in production occur when the same set of resources can be used to make one good or another. So Apple requires circuit boards, and microprocessors, and screens, and plastic to make the frames. And they can use that material to either make an iPad or an iPhone. They can't use the material to make one and the other because of scarcity. And so that's one or the other. So these are substitutes in production. And when you have substitutes in production, a change in the price of one good affects the supply of the other. So if the price of iPhones rises, if iPhones are selling at a higher price than before, then Apple would be very interested in making more iPhones because they earn more money by the sale of iPhones. So they'll increase the quantity of iPhones being supplied. And because there's more iPhones being made, there's less material there for Apple to make iPads. So the supply of iPads will fall because they simply can't make as many as before. And that's what actually happens in the real world. From an article that appeared in the Wall Street Journal, we see that Apple cut back its production of iPads when the price of iPhones went up. So that's a real world example of how substitutes in production sort of works out. And we also have complements in production. That's when you make one good as a byproduct of making another. So milk and butter, for example, are complementary goods in supply. The dairy will milk cows and they have the milk, and when the milk settles in the pan or in the bucket, it tends to separate, and you have cream goes to the top and the liquid milk is at the bottom. And so the dairy can skim the cream off of the top and they can use that cream to produce butter. So the more milk they're making, the more butter they get. So if the price of milk rises, that would indicate that there's more milk being produced, the greater quantity supplied of milk. And as more milk is being produced, that means there's more cream to make butter. So the supply of butter will also increase. So the change in the related prices will impact our supply curve for another good. Input prices also matter. The cost of production influences the supply of goods. The more expensive it is to produce, the fewer goods you will produce. All things being equal, if it costs me more to make something than before, then I can't afford to make as many goods as I could before. So an increase in the production costs, an increase in the inputs that go into making things leads to a reduction in the supply of the good. And again, what we see is a left shift for less and a right shift for more. Competition matters. The number of people producing a good impacts the market supply. Again, the market supply is the sum of all the individual supply curves. So if the market isn't just Mr. Figueroa making coffee beans, then if the price is $2, he'll supply 3,000 pounds of coffee beans. But if we add another supplier to the mix, then at a price of $2, we have 5,000 pounds of total coffee beans being produced because we've got two different suppliers adding them together. So the more competitors, there is an increase in supply. The fewer competitors, there is a decrease in supply. With expectations, just like with demand, suppliers have a choice of when to provide a good or service. So it sort of depends on what you expect the price to be. If I think that there'll be greater demand tomorrow, I think there'll be a higher price for my goods, then I will maybe hold off on producing those goods now and make them available for sale on the market later. If I think there'll be less demand in the future, I'd probably want to get rid of as much stuff as I can. I'll see an increase in supply. So it just sort of depends on what I expect to happen. So, gasoline producers are making gasoline They know that summer months are a high demand month for that product, and so they're refining they're refining oil into gasoline in the winter in preparation for selling it in the summer when the prices are higher. Now let's take a moment to sort of put this all together. As Thomas Sowell has noted, neither supply nor demand by itself explains prices. Prices are determined by the combined effects of the two. You won't know what the price and quantity of a good will be until we put supply and demand together. Supply curve is just all the possible combinations. Demand is all the possible combinations. What the actual combination will be is where the two intersect. And it has to be that way. If the price of the market was above equilibrium, if the price was greater than the price where the supply and demand curves intersect, then we would see that the quantity supplied, QS, is greater than the quantity demanded. We have what is known as a surplus. And when there is a surplus, there's extra goods sitting around. So if you're a producer and you're sitting there going, golly, I've got all these products sitting on my shelves and it doesn't make sense for me to make it and not sell it. That's certainly a waste of resources, time, and effort. I'd like to get rid of these products I made, but no one seems to want it. Then what would you do? You'd have a sale. You'd lower the price. And as the price goes down, more people are interested in purchasing the good. And so we begin to see the market approach that intersection point of price, of supply and demand. And if the price were below that equilibrium, if price was below the intersection of supply and demand, then we would say that we have now quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied, and we have what's known as a shortage, or as the French like to call it, a shortage. And when there's a shortage or a shortage, and I'm a producer, I'm sitting there saying to myself, golly, I'm trying to sell this product, but I've got a line all the way out the door and around the corner, and I have nothing to sell people. Well, I'm missing out on an opportunity. People are desperate for my product. So I ought to make more and shoot. If so many people want this thing, probably ought to raise the price a little bit. And as you increase the price, and as the quantity supplied is increasing, you're driving some people out. Some people aren't willing to pay that higher price, and that's okay. Because as they walk out of line and you're bringing more goods into the store and the price is rising, you'll eventually find yourself again at that equilibrium point, that intersection of supply and demand. And that's where things sort of stop, because it's at supply and demand where the quantity supplied, the quantity available equals the quantity demanded. Everyone's willing to pay or receive the same amount for that good, and boom, there's now no longer too much and too little. There's just the right amount. If you look at it on a graph, we would see that if the price is $5, the quantity demanded is 50. There's 250 available, surplus of 200. That's too much. And so I got to get rid of it. So I lower the price, and I'll lower the price all the way to $3, because at $3, there's 150 demanded, 150 supplied, no problem. If the price is $1, there'd be 250 demanded, but only 50 supplied. That's a shortage or a shortage of 200 units. Not okay. I better raise the price in order to try and thin the line and to meet the needs of the market, and I will continue to raise that price and produce more goods until I get to $3, which is the equilibrium point. Again, there's no shortage, there's no surplus, there's just the right amount. So graphically, equilibrium always where supply and demand curves intersect. We call that the market clearing price. No shortage, no surplus, quantity demanded equals quantity supplied, and it is what we refer to as being allocatively efficient. That is, I cannot make somebody better off without making somebody else worse off. What happens when we're not at equilibrium? Sometimes chaos. Like at the Home Depot. Attention customers, we're out of the following: no sleds, no heaters, no ice melt, no firewood, no shovels, no generators, no nothing. We're out of everything. There must be a snowstorm. People are desperate for these products. Their demand has increased as a result of a change in their expectations, and yet maybe the problem here is lower prices guaranteed. Maybe the price hasn't risen to the equilibrium point, and when that situation occurs, you end up with shortages like you have in the picture. All right, we're going to continue our conversation on supply and demand next time, and I will talk to you then.